I'm Patrick Perdue, AmeriVet's co-head of capital markets, and I'll be moderating today's discussion on disaster relief and assistance with Vice Admiral retired Mike LeFever of the U.S. Navy. Before we get started, I wanted to give special thanks to the WVI Dolphin Foundation here in New York City, who connected us with Admiral LeFever. The WVI Dolphin Foundation inspires its wealthy intergenerational families to pivot towards give back, then channels those funds to earlier stage charities aligned with the Dolphin culture that supports veterans and sports for good initiatives. An additional thanks to Concentric, a risk consultancy firm based out of Seattle, specializing in strategic security and intelligence services, of which Admiral LeFever is the CEO. Thank you for joining me this morning, Admiral LeFever.
Thanks so much. Really enjoy being here.
Admiral LeFever was placed in charge of the U.S. military response to two natural disasters in Pakistan from 2005 to 2006, and then again from 2008 to 2011, working in the Disaster Assistance Center and coordinating our assistance and response. Again, Admiral, welcome to this segment today. Perhaps I turn it over to you for a quick background and tell us about yourself.
Great. Thanks, Pat. It's really great to be here and a part of this, and thank you so much. When I left the Naval Academy, when I graduated, I was a surface warfare officer. So I served a lot of time on frigates, destroyers. I even had a great opportunity to be the second in command of a hydrofoil. I had cruisers. I was a destroyer squadron commodore, and then of the Stennis Strike Group, Desron 21, and also Expeditionary Strike Group commander out of San Diego, which composed of 5,500 Marines and sailors, several amphibious ships and cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. And then I finished up after leading two joint task force, one that we're going to talk about today, one leading the earthquake relief effort in Pakistan. And then later when I went back as the senior defense representative for Pakistan for 3 years, where I served from July of 2008 to July 11 through the Bin Laden raid. And then I left there and became the director at for strategic operational planning at our National Counterterrorism Center before retiring a few years ago. And so my experience with disaster relief, I was, riding. We were in the Gulf. My Marines were committed to work with General Casey for the election in 2005 when this devastating earthquake hit Pakistan, a 7.6 earthquake that killed 78,000 people, had 177,000 injured, and 3.5 million people homeless during the winter season in the Himalayas and the Karakoram Mountains that we became a part of, and served there for about 7 months as things settled in as leading the U.S. relief effort. During that effort, it became kind of the benchmark for all U.S. humanitarian disaster relief efforts. It was heralded as quite the event from the standpoint of the civilian-military relationships and how we support it, and then the recognition that we received from Pakistan in supporting and saving so many lives. Then when I was there as the senior military rep and commander of all U.S. forces in Pakistan in 2008 to 11, in 2010, there was a horrific flood that started at the headwaters of the Indus River and went all the way down to the ocean. When you put it and pose that on a map, it would stretch from Maine to Florida, the amount of flood and devastations and the millions of people that were displaced. Again, we were called in to be able to support and provide incredible humanitarian relief, air support, food, supplies, and so forth for that relief effort as well.
Oh, thanks, Admiral. Certainly unprecedented times. Every day it's a battle station report when everybody wakes up looking at the absolute numbers on a global basis. Latest numbers I saw, global virus infections approaching 1.4 million, approaching 100 million in deaths. The U.S. has overtaken all other countries, obviously, on the infection front, with New York City sort of being front and center again. Very close to our heart with our headquarters right in Midtown. But Admiral, from your standpoint, how does this current coronavirus crisis, similar to past experiences that you've encountered and had some experiences in?
Pat, it's interesting. Having been exposed to those two different tragic events, granted on a smaller scale than what we're experiencing with this incredible pandemic, which is just having incredible societal and economic disruptions. But what my experience has showed is that there is almost a pattern to these crises. There's the initial onslaught when the crisis hits, this idea of this kind of overwhelming the normal resources and supplies that you have. There's a sense of almost panic and despair and how are we going to handle this? Then there's really a stage there where you kind of start getting settled in, you're providing the emergency relief supplies, you're settling as kind of the 911 force. And then there's a part where you're trying to anticipate second and third order effects of what's going to happen. You know, for us, it was because of impure water or sanitation, there was cholera and dysentery. Here, what we're experiencing is the masks, the PPEs, the ventilators, and that kind of stuff. And how do you get ahead of that? Then you almost settle into kind of a phase 3, which I would consider more or less stabilization. Things are getting back to normal. And then you have a kind of a rebuild, reconstruction period. You know, how do we get back totally? But what I found fascinating in all these events was that this overarching goal to try to return to normalcy as soon as possible, because that was key to start calming things down and getting back to a normal way of life.
Thanks, Admiral. One of the interesting things that I had read recently was Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer has urged the White House to appoint a czar to oversee the medical equipment production and distribution. He suggested it be a military man, some of the or military person for that matter. The list included former Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Selva, Admiral Winfield, Admiral Hartgetek. Obviously, there's precedent for using the military in instances of moving goods and services. How do you see the military involved in this particular instance going forward?
Yeah, the list of names that you read are just kind of fantastic leaders. And what I've noticed is, you know, the military by its nature sometimes is really the person that has, you know, we have the resources, we have the planning and training to deal with crises. It's kind of in our blood of how we go about things. And there's really no other department or agency like the U.S. military that you know, really operates at that scale that we could do. The things that I noticed when, you know, the ability to have strategic airlift, the ability for strategic sea lift, the planning, the know-how is all very important. So when I see them to the military, you know, helping in this regard, we have a tenet in our, you know, kind of a command and control arrangements where we talk about supporting relationships, where the supported commander is the one that's getting, you know, he's the person in charge. There only needs to be one person in charge, and all the other entities are there to support them in the best way that's possible. And so what I see playing out is essentially what we're doing today, trying to play to the strengths, leveraging that capacity, ensuring the greatest capacity to and capability to be able to combat this virus. And so in regards to this like pandemic or from some of the natural disasters, the U.S. military is largely called in a supporting role, both in Pakistan and here. You know, the U.S. military is called in this particular role under Title U.S. Code 32 to augment this capacity. And so you see the deployment in the National Guard and hospital ships and military support airlift and other military hospitals around. I think now that the number of states is over 20, and there's like 20 requests in the mill to the governors and then to the Secretary of Defense and President for approval to use those military support. And so I think using it and understanding that capacity and capability and best how do you use that in this particular pandemic is the key to our success. And so the military is in that supporting role, supporting the civilian leadership in this cause.
Oh, that's great, Admiral. Appreciate that insight. you were quoted as saying the key to humanitarian operations is trying to get the population back to normalcy as quickly as you can. You touched upon that briefly in the past statement. What do you see are potential challenges here in the U.S. to get back to normalcy from your standpoint? Obviously, there's a lot to absorb there. There's economics, there's jobs, but perhaps from your standpoint, what do you see as the big challenge in the next 4 to 8 weeks as we try to get back to normalcy? Is it hospitals and supplies? Is it something else that perhaps we haven't thought about? It'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on that, sir.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, in the disasters that I was in, this sense that, when people knew that there was the medical supplies were helping, the shelters were there, the food, the other support that was coming either from the government, non-government agencies, civilian firms, whatever, to be able to provide that to the populations, that became a calming factor to bring that normalcy to those population centers. For us, it was something as simple as the Naval Construction Battalions would build temporary facilities for schools that then our U.S. Department of State aid agency and the disaster assistance response team would hire teachers to be able to instruct, and that was a calming thing. For us, I think the biggest challenge, as you had mentioned, is this transition that people bring back to the routines of their work, whether it's the work or schools or group events or travel. How do we restore that confidence in their everyday life and then minimize that risk of resurgence? I think as we're watching other countries go through this, as this is kind of almost like a flooding the different areas across the globe, we could learn, and that could be illustrative of how we go back to that. But I think the two aspects that are critical for us as we look forward is going to be both the physical and the psychological effect on people, that they will feel safe in their environments, and to the extent that it's possible to get back to their normal way of life, to go back into the offices, to go back into the schools, to go to largely attended events and feel safe about that.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. And I think one of the challenges perhaps that someone that picks up a lot of their information from news outlets, there's a lot of noise coming out from different authorities. So I imagine in very acute disaster response scenarios can lead to an effect of perhaps having a lot of cooks in the kitchen, so to speak. It's obviously important to minimize that noise and put personnel and organizational egos aside during these times. But what has your assessment been on the interaction between the federal government, the state governments, and even the towns and the cities? Each one of them respectively have their own health departments. How does something such as an outbreak like this, a pandemic that spans the globe, and more importantly from us on the U.S. perspective, how do we look at that, sir?
I think we have to look at it holistically and understanding the different dynamics. When I was at the National Counterterrorism Center, when we did these joint counterterrorism awareness workshops, it was interesting to bring this all the different agencies, federal, state, local, bureau, tribal, as well as the civilian community together to understand how you communicate and how do you best utilize each other's resources in such an event. In that particular thing was a terrorism event, a Mumbai-style attack or whatever. But I think you can apply it here. And so the lessons learned we learned in those was the idea of having, what we talk about is kind of really stressing the idea that you have to leave your personal and professional ego at the door and to really have this common purpose. And it's about the mission and about saving lives. And so as I went through and looked at different lessons learned, that idea of everybody on the same page is very key. I think the reinforcement that everyone on the team and bringing them together has that same understanding of what that mission is and how to reinforce it. How do you have that consistent messaging? Communication, you can't over-communicate enough in an event like this. And I think the team together with a unified voice is really powerful message and a calming influence to the population. We talked about suspending that organizational ego. The other thing that I think was key that I found useful in some of these events was what we would call a common operating picture. And that was to ensure that everybody was on the same page. It's tracking the disaster impact, the evolution, the resources that are available, and everybody has that sense, because in that, when everybody's looking at the same facts and same information and sharing that information, then we're able to really maximize the potential. We can reduce the duplication of effort or lost time, people trying to do the same things. Likewise, each of these institutions, like the military and others, all have some unique capabilities. And so the idea of leveraging each of those specialty areas and a partner system to be able to depend on those, again, so you don't duplicate efforts. And then the idea of kind of repurposing resources. We're seeing a lot of great lessons learned about how hospitals are configuring their systems or eliminating elective surgery to be influenced by just, this is a COVID hospital. This is not, to minimize the spread. So you're seeing some things. We had helos that, literally had bullet holes in coming from Afghanistan, the next day, and now flying relief efforts. And they became dubbed as the Angels of Mercy. And so, having that idea of, hey, here's some equipment that can be repurposed for the better good. The other key is, as these communities and organizations get together, is to leverage those relationships and leverage the network, the amazing civilian-military relationships, the amazing industries that are stepping up that contribute and has so much to offer. Even if it's big or small, the key is that everybody has something to contribute, and to be able to have that and acknowledge that and acknowledge the reward of what they're doing. One of the things that also is in this communication that I found very effective was having this normal, predictable cadence of when you would talk, when you would have the communication or meetings and updates on your numbers, your efforts, what you're facing, and so forth. I think, watching, Governor Cuomo has been fascinating, how he's incredible information that he's putting out at his briefings. And so by sharing that information, everybody has a better understanding, and we can get ahead of that curve as well. Likewise, there should be resources in the back that are kind of a planning team. This is to anticipate that next wave of challenges, and we have examples of that. What happened overseas? What happened here in Seattle, where I am now, at ground zero, that's now spreading amazingly across the East Coast and into New York is kind of now the major epicenter. And how do you take those lessons learned and apply them so that people can learn from them? So it's a great opportunity for how people can come together and the synergy of the effect of being much greater than the sum of its parts.
Yeah. Admiral, obviously, there's been talk of the Navy in crisis. We've had some major decisions happening over the past 48 hours. Start with the Navy Secretary Tom Modly resigning following what I thought was a very odd activity from him to go down and talk directly to the crew of the aircraft carrier, Teddy Roosevelt. One of the things that struck me from my Navy days, we always talked about combat readiness and force readiness, and at any one time knowing that the commander-in-chief has certain assets available to him to protect the United States. It's a little disconcerting that the coronavirus sidelined one of the largest ships in the Navy, and the effects of that. And do you want to touch upon that and how you see, being a submariner, it takes 4 torpedoes to sink an aircraft carrier. It didn't take any this time, and how perhaps this new outlook is going to change on how the military perhaps goes about its service or even put ships together. What do you think about that, Admiral?
Well, it is a fascinating, a lot going on and a lot there. I usually say there's probably 3 sides to every story. but it was odd, some of the sequence of events and his resignation as of yesterday. I think it is a great learning point for us about how we would do that. I think I remember reading somewhere where the commanding officer said, if needed, I could get this ship underway and fight as we are expected to call upon. And I think what he was weighing, or what his recommendation was at a time where we weren't, and here's an opportunity to minimize potentially the spread of infection for his crew, is what he went to the chain of command about. And so I think but it is an interesting one that I think we talked at it during our national planning for our counterterrorism when I was the director of strategic ops and plans. And a pandemic like this was always incredibly challenging because of the understand, and it triggers certain points to be able to be coded as a pandemic that then really wakes up the whole World Health Organization to figure out a cure and a cause. And so these are very interesting, and I think it will also influence how we do when things like this occur. How do we isolate crews and so forth, potentially from going ashore or moving, on a port calls or whatever, to be able to minimize the risk of a pandemic that has its first indications. So I think this is going to be a great after action, which I'm a firm believer in of what we do, and that's one of the key events that I think we need to do after this is really review all the intel, the facts. What do we need to sustain? What do we need to improve on? What happened that we really didn't expect, and how do we plan for that for the future, so that this, and I read a thing where this wasn't a black swan, this was a gray rhinoceros, which I love the analogy, is that we knew it was out there, we just didn't know what it was coming at us. And so we suspect that this will come, the next 100 years or whatever. And so to be prepared and take these lessons learned and apply them to our future design and process, I think would be an invaluable outcome of this tragic event.
Well, Admiral, I really appreciate your insights derived from years of experience and leadership. On behalf of AmeriVet Securities, the WVI Dolphin Foundation, Concentric, thank you for joining us today. Special thanks to the WVI Dolphin Foundation for enabling this. Admiral, any last words to say before we cut off here, sir?
Yeah, I think I'd probably leave with one thing, and I think this is one of the keys. It was funny. It was a funny story that I like to recount. I'm on the ground in Pakistan. Just flew off my strike group. So I'm 700 miles from saltwater, and General Abizaid and General Lute, the CENTCOM commander, were there on the ground about 2 to 3 weeks into the events that were going on the ground, the earthquake. And they looked at me and says, hey, what is your exit strategy? And I looked at them puzzled because we hadn't even flown in the 2 different hospitals and about 30 helicopters and so forth. But it was very insightful guidance, I thought, when you think back on it, is looking forward and thinking about that new future, because it really helped me think strategically about, thinking through these efforts and what this end state was going to be. And so I think in this regard, the pandemic we're facing, I think it is critical that we know we're going to get through this. This is kind of a bad storm. This is just weather, but we're going to get through this. But now to anticipate what those variables are to inform us of the future state, and how do we need to be set up for success as we come out of that, for the medical community, for the business community, to recover and thrive when the worst of this crisis is behind us. And so I would as we think about, the impact now, I think it'd be important for us to think about the future ahead and how do we posture for that. Those are some of the things we do as we talk about risks with some of our clients at Concentric, but it's also a great thing that we could do as a nation.
True. And Admiral, I think this lines up for us to do sort of a recap in a few months and see, what came out of our thoughts today in 3 months and what actually it looks like, and perhaps do a post-op on that. But again, thank you very much for your time. Take care and stay safe, Admiral.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you today. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.